Well, greetings to all of you and welcome to the First Unitarian Church here in Salt Lake City. Not that we're actually in the church right now, but as we have come to learn through these many weeks that the church really means all of us together. And how we hang together, it could be in the physical plant, it could be at our homes where we're just thinking about each other. The main thing is that we really feel the presence of one another and come to understand the church is all of us. And so as you're looking at your screen in the comfort of your home, and I'm standing in the comfort of my home, looking at this little dot at the end of the iPad, I can only hope that you are there, that this whole thing makes sense, and with that kind of faith, I bid you all a warm welcome to the First Unitarian Church. And of course, I want to know, and we all want to know this about each other, how are you holding up? How are you dealing, how are you getting through this global pandemic? There really are, we have come to learn, some strains and stresses, learning about new ways of being, new ways of trying to be, and as challenging as this COVID-19 is for us, we have undoubtedly made some new friends in this pandemic. You know, when this is all over and we're free to roam this earth once again anywhere we want and with whom we want and all those fine things, we're going to think back during this time and we're going to remember our friends. We're going to remember the books we read during the pandemic, those authors. Who are those authors who carried us through? We're going to remember the TV series that perhaps helped us through the evening. Oh yes, they are indeed friends. We're going to remember the music we played, the recording artists. These are friends of ours now who helped us through this very difficult time in all of history, not only our personal history, but throughout all of time. And you know, the funny thing is, we may even think back fondly about Zoom and the virtual cocktail parties that Zoom has afforded us through this pandemic. And hopefully we will laugh at all this forced togetherness that has been thrust upon us. Parents teaching their children school lessons, our pets who look at us differently now, wondering, why are you still here? Why don't you ever leave? Pets just don't really seem to understand. They're a bit confused. And so we're going to remember many things that got us through this pandemic, and hopefully they'll provide both a little bit of humor and a little bit of sentiment. Let me just make a couple of very brief announcements. I want to make sure that everyone realizes that the annual meeting has been pushed to May 31st. We want to make sure, by we, I mean many of the Board of Trustees want to make sure that we are able to offer a budget that will really make sense in these uncertain times, all sorts of contingencies, and we just want to present this in a digestible format, so we're going to need a little bit more time to do this. So May 31st at 10 o'clock, we're going to have our congregational meeting. Forgive me, I think it's at 11 o'clock we're going to have our congregational meeting on Sunday the 31st. And we are going to tell you exactly how to tune into this, and also what's really tricky is we're going to figure out and inform you how we're going to be able to vote at the annual meeting. And once we get that down, and if we are successful in voting, then we will forward that plan to the national government so that during election time in next November, they'll have it figured out how we're able to vote. There's going to be no designated offering this Sunday because we know that you know how important every dollar is to this church right now at this time, since we have literally no other stream of income aside from you. So whenever the Spirit moves, please give through your Givelify app or push the donate button on our website. Or if you want to be really old-fashioned, it's almost hard to conceive, you may want to sit down and write a check and mail that to the church sometime during the worship service. Now, of course, it's really gauche to just start writing checks in the middle of a worship service, but nobody can see you. So you're free to do silly things like that. Write a check during the service, put it in an envelope, and mail it to the church whenever you can. After David lights the chalice this morning, and we sing a hymn, Amanda will introduce our theme for today, and she's going to really target our youngsters, but it's really for all of us. Today we celebrate the church members who have died throughout this past year, a tradition that we began, I believe, more than 15 years ago. Remembering the dear people whose lives mingled with ours in loving ways is an important exercise for all generations. We all feel the loss of those who were part of that fabric of our church community. So for now, let us turn our attention to David as he will light the chalice for us.
Good morning. I'm David Owens, the Director of Music here at First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. Welcome, and may you join us this morning for a special service dedicated to the memory of those that we have lost, either recently or in the past. We still hold them in our hearts. And to celebrate that memory, if you want to get your votive chalice at home or a candle, let's light our chalices at home in honor of those. And as we go through this service and the light of their life continues to burn, let's keep them in our memory. And to our greater community, we light our church chalice. Symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibility of love. Please join me as we sing the first two verses of hymn number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song.
Hi, I am in the garden today, and look at what I found. I found a seed, but this is not just any seed. This is the everything seed. And I have a story to tell you about this. The story was originally written by the Reverend Carol Martineco. I am retelling it today. It is called the everything seed. Have you ever watched a seed grow? Have you noticed that it begins so small, so still, so quiet, like a gift waiting to be opened, and how it slowly wakes up, beginning it to unfold and growing into something larger and larger? Then you know that whatever comes for the seed usually ends up looking a little bit like the seed that it came from, which is also true of the very first seed. Long, long ago, way back before the beginning, so long ago that there was no such thing as time because there was nobody there to count it. Everything was a huge, deep, mysterious place, like something waiting to happen. There were no stars, no moon, there was no place on earth, no rocks or flowers or any living being. But in that deep, waiting space was hidden the tiniest point of something no bigger than a seed. It was not a flower seed, not an oak tree seed, although all of those things were inside that seed. You would call it the everything seed because that's what it became. No one knows where that first seed came from or how it was planted, but they know that it, like any good seed, it knew when to grow just at that right moment. So the seed, nourished and cradled into space, woke up, broke open, and began to unfold, unfolding and blossoming forth into an enormous blaze of light. And the universe was born. Out fluttered galaxies like a storm of snowflakes swirling and gathering into the brightest, most blindingly beautiful clouds of stars. And our own star, the sun, and our earth, and the moon, and all of us here on this planet came to be. And that's the secret of this little seed. You and I are here from the very beginning, just as each oak leaf was hidden inside each acorn. We were all there with the stars and the planets and the rocks and the people. Everything that is now, everything that was or ever will be, was inside of that tiny seed. And one day, we will leave our bodies and go back to the earth and back to that seed. And when we are not here, when people we love are not here, we are reminded that when you hold this seed, we are with them and they are with us. This seed is part of you, and it's part of those that came before you, came before them to the very start of the universe. And that one day we will also go back there, lovingly cradled, held within the everything seed.
Today's reading is by C.S.Lewis, whom you may recognize as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia books. Lewis wrote a great many books, and this book, Grief Observed, was written near the end of his life upon the loss of his wife Joy, whom in this reading Lewis calls H, to cancer. Here's the reading. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed, There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. There are moments, most unexpectedly, when something inside me tries to assure me that I don't really mind so much, not so very much, after all. Love is not the whole of a man's life. I was happy before I ever met H. I've plenty of what are called resources. People get over these things. One is ashamed to listen to this voice, but it seems for a little to be making out a good case. Then comes a sudden jolt of red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. And no one ever told me about the laziness of grief, except at my job, where the machine seems to run on much as usual. I loathe the slightest effort. Not only writing, but even reading a letter is too much. Even shaving. What does it matter now whether my cheek is rough or smooth? Meanwhile, where is God? This is one of the most disquieting symptoms. When you are happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing God, if you remember yourself and turn to God with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. I tried to put some of these thoughts to a friend this afternoon. He reminded me that the same thing seems to have happened to Christ. Why hast thou forsaken me? I know. Does that make it easier to understand? Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about God. The conclusion I dread is not, so there is no God after all, but so this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer. Many of us know C.S.Lewis as a Christian apologist and the author of the Chronicles of Narnia series of books. What you may not realize about Lewis is that he became an atheist at the age of 15 and remained so until his 30s, when another famous author, J.R.R. Tolkien, convinced him to reconvert to Christianity. Lewis described this process as being dragged kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting my eyes in every direction for a chance to escape. But something of the atheist always did remain in Lewis's thinking. Lewis was also a confirmed bachelor, a bachelor don, teaching at Oxford University. Until late in life, he met the American poet Joy Davidman Grisham, who had emigrated to England with her 2 young boys to escape a deteriorating marriage. Lewis became good friends with Grisham, with her vivacious spirit and her sparkling intellect. He agreed to a civil marriage with her in order to help her avoid deportation, but soon found himself falling in love with her and decided to marry her in a religious ceremony to celebrate their new relationship. Almost as soon as they were married, Joy developed great pain in her hip, and what she first thought was arthritis turned out to be cancer. Their marriage lasted just 3 short years, and she was dead. Lewis had never been a man given to soul-searching. His friend and biographer Chad Walsh said of him, "To him, an ideal conversation was an intellectual fencing match, and may the one with the best dialectic win. The few times I crossed swords with him, he won." I also noticed that he seemed singularly uninterested in introspection. He found so many things outside himself interesting that he had no time to study himself. At least, that was the impression that grew on me, though I had to modify it when years later I read A Grief Observed. A Grief Observed is one of Lewis's greatest works, just 90 pages, in which he records in heartbreaking detail the fine contours of his loss. Unused to exploring his own feelings, he ruthlessly allows himself no more than 4 notebooks to get it all out. "I resolve to let this limit my jottings," he says. "I will not start buying books for the purpose." He goes on, "Insofar as this record was a defense against total collapse, a safety valve, it has done some good. The other end I had in view turns out to have been based on a misunderstanding. I thought I could describe a state, make a map of sorrow. Sorrow, however, turns out not to be a state, but a process. It needs not a map, but a history. Grief is like a long valley, a winding valley where any bend may reveal a totally new landscape. As I've already noted, not every bend does. Sometimes the surprise is the opposite one. You are presented with exactly the same sort of country you thought you had left behind miles ago." The British satirist Thomas Carlyle once said, "Life is one long quarrel with God, but we make up in the end." And as Lewis writes his history down through the layers of grief, as a paleontologist works through layers of history in the soil, he does finally get God to answer the door for him. He stops wondering who and what his wife really is to him now that she's gone, and he more keenly understands his own process for managing his grief. Lewis begins his memoir of grief, as we heard in our reading, with, "No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear." In these times we're living in, we may be surprised to discover that as the ground shifts beneath our feet, old grief rises to the surface, shaken out by the fear we are feeling about these precarious times. Some of us must manage these old losses, even as we recover from recent ones, those departed beloved whom we remember in this service today. But we also find the bones of those who are long gone, as well as the worry for our own lives and the lives of those living among us. Time and love are collapsed into two dimensions, and we find ourselves covering uncannily familiar territory of fear and loss, as Lewis suggests. The remedy is to take time to become still and observe your grief, all of it, all the layers. Set each grief out in front of you and observe it. And observe what arises in you, where the sensations are in your body, what other emotions they remind you of. Observe the size, the character, the complexity of your grief. Observe, too, the ground itself, your interior environment. If you're a believer in God, do you feel abandoned in your grief? If you're an atheist, do you suddenly find yourself tempted to pray to or rage at the God you don't believe in? What is shifting in your spiritual life as you touch each old or new loss? And what remains the same? Be gentle with yourself as you discover your own history, and be gentle with others as they too are unearthing the past while suffering the blows of the present. Keep your tender heart open to the possibility of love and care, even as we are physically separated from one another. And know that whatever happens, things always change. This won't last forever. We'll get through it together.
The reading today comes from a dear, dear friend of mine, John Dober. And some of you old-timers may remember John. He's been to our church a couple of times. In fact, when we started our very first capital campaign, the one that built the RE building, that was 1989. We had a big fundraising dinner, and our guest of honor was John Dober. He is a UU minister out in California, and also a very funny man. Before he entered the ministry, his life was that of a nightclub entertainer. He was just a humorist. He did everything. He was a stand-up comic, essentially, is what he was. And then he also came back when we had our very first celebration Sunday. And so hopefully some of you may remember him. He's a very, very dear friend. And this is a piece that I think is very warm, very touching, and something that we can probably all relate to. And it goes like this. If we are lucky and diligent, we will make friends, some of whom will turn out to be good friends. These special people in our lives are a product of luck, chemistry, and some effort. They ride us through life, sharing our good times and bad, our triumphs and tragedies. Some of these people we see often. We are in constant touch and really keep up with each other. And because of the everyday nature of these friendships, we do not notice them growing old or changing. They just are, like the earth and sky, like family. Other friends may be more distant in time and space. We may not see them regularly, but when we do, it's as if no time has passed. We pick up right where we left off a year or even a decade before. Since we do not see them age or change, when we do get together, it's sometimes a bit of a shock. Where is that rail thin girl? What happened to that athletic young man? And where did his hair go? But after that first moment, our eyes adjust and we see them back with the old pictures in our heads of them in their youth and with the eyes of our youth. My wife and I are planning to go to England this summer, and I was looking forward to see my old pal, Alan Phillips. We spent a year in Tunisia, in the British version of the Peace Corps, while I was in our Peace Corps. We saw each other every day, and he ate at my house probably twice a week. We played chess every day for a year, and I never won. The best I did was one single stalemate. He was brilliant, with an all-alpha first degree from Oxford. He spoke perfect French, German, and clipped Oxonian British English. He had a dry wit and a generous heart, and he was a very honest and reliable person, with one sole exception. He bragged about how hot he loved curry. When my service was over, I visited him at Oxford, and we went to his favorite curry house and ordered the very hottest one on the menu, the nth degree. And as we ate, he kept telling me how much he was enjoying it, as our teeth ached and our hair perspired and we hiccuped from the heat. Now, over the years, we did not write, but I saw him, his wife Judith, and his growing family when I passed through England, did part of my sabbatical in England, and once when we shared a trail of ground in the south of France. Another time, our two families let a cottage for a week in Ashdown Forest. My memory of this week is incomplete, since the ancient cottage had low beams, and I was incapable of passing under them without hitting my head. So, as soon as we booked our flight, I called Alan, eager to get together and renew our friendship. But he wasn't there. Judith told me he had passed away a few years ago. I was flummoxed. I had no idea what to say. I was not a professional able to give wise counsel and comfort. I was a friend suffering an unpleasant loss, an unacceptable loss that will take time to accept. I wasn't filled with guilt for not keeping in touch. We didn't have to. I was and am filled with regret that I'll never see him again. And of course that his wife and two daughters will be robbed of his good company and great love. But mostly, I can't believe it. The default picture in my head, despite the passage of 40 years, is of a young man filled with life. I want to cry out like Lear, Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou shalt come no more, never, 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 never. Well, perhaps that sounds a bit melodramatic, but it's true. It's a true existential cry from my heart of frustration and loss. I suppose the easy and normal epiphany that people share at times of loss is that it's a reminder of how precious life is and how both dear and fragile life is. But just because it sounds like a cliche doesn't make it banal or untrue. Now, sometimes I joke that I have only one core message, and every talk or article is a repetition of that. Despite how large and complex the world is and how small and powerless we sometimes feel, what we choose and what we do make a difference. I believe this profoundly, but it is not my one message. I have another. Time is the only gift we have that is worth giving. Let me repeat that. Time is the only gift we have that is worth giving. Where and with whom we spend the precious time that is our lives indicates what we value and whom we value. Time once spent can never be spent again, but neither can it be rendered into nothingness as long as we live. The wise would not avoid the pain of loss by not having had friendships. There is no wisdom in saving our hearts from breaking by not giving them. My lesson for you is quite simple, but hard to do when young. Take pictures with your hearts. Take pictures with your hearts of those who love you and whom you love. Keep them as a treasury to draw upon. Neither our vulnerability nor mortality itself is the enemy of life. They are but reminders of how precious each day, each kiss, and each embrace. That ends our reading for today. Woody Allen once lamented that you could never find a therapist in New York City in the month of August. And that's probably true. And of course, Woody, being Woody, seemed to always have most urgent need of a therapist during the end of summer. Now, much can be said about the dearth of therapists available in Salt Lake City, or actually anywhere in the country right now. Not because of a mass exodus among therapists seeking a vacation, but because the demand for therapy right now is probably at an all-time high. Now, we may know on some level that loss is an inescapable part of life. Loss is a part of everyone's life. And loss is recognized in so many different ways. In the death of a loved one, separation or divorce, unemployment, relocation, immigration, natural disasters, illness. This time of global pandemic has caused us to experience many, many losses. Not necessarily the lives of people who are close to us, although we're certainly cognizant that the death of so many wonderful people has occurred during this pandemic. But losses come to us in waves and in many, many different manifestations. There's the loss of jobs. There's the loss of everything that we've taken for granted. There's a loss of income. There's a loss of socialization. There's a loss of just regular contact, person-to-person contact with friends. The loss of just picking up and going to see a movie. Can't do that anymore. Let's go see a show. Can't do that anymore. Hey, let's go have dinner after we hear a concert. No, we can't do this anymore. And so these losses are just compounded day after day, week after week, month after month, as we realize that our lives have really changed completely, and it dawns on us that we have lost so much. And with each loss, there is a period of grief. And grief is a personal journey. There are many stages of grief, we are taught, and there may be books that inspire and groups that support us in our grief. But fundamentally, although grief is experienced universally, it always takes on unique expressions of how one deals with one's loss. There are no right or wrong ways in grieving. Loss is a terribly shattering experience, and I mean shattering quite literally. Your world, as you have come to know it and love it and appreciate it, is suddenly smashed into a million pieces. Grief, then, is the process by which we pick up the pieces and try to keep living meaningfully. It's not as easy as it sounds. Now, people tend to schedule appointments with therapists when there's a crisis in their lives, and most crises boil down, you guessed it, to loss. The loss could pertain to an important relationship, or it can pertain to a loss of security, like a job, an income, or a home. There's suddenly a need to look deep inside oneself and try to understand life at a different level, or perhaps even from a different perspective. Of course, we can't always comprehend loss rationally, as though it were a puzzle that we could just kind of figure out and piece it back together. However, what we can try to piece together after a loss is personal meaning. We're going to get into that a little bit more deeply. Louise Penny is a Canadian mystery writer who has become my friend, incidentally, during this pandemic. In fact, I'm always going to think back on COVID-19 as the time when Louise Penny and I found each other, or at least I found her, and she threw a lifeline to me. And I'm always going to associate Louise Penny with COVID-19. Not that she would appreciate that, but that's how it has come to pass. A character who runs throughout her books is a black psychotherapist named Myrna. And Myrna claimed that the catalyst for driving people to seek therapy is loss. People see therapists because of loss and change. Now here's where we see the intersection between Buddhist thought and psychotherapy. Change is loss, loss results from change. Buddhists and therapists are often alike in trying to help us understand the need to accept that nothing, actually nothing, is permanent, and that change is inevitable. Loss and change and loss are forever linked together. A kind of loss, or I should say any kind of loss, signals change, and every change signals a loss. And what makes this so difficult is when we lose control. We lose control over our lives. Deep down, we're all control freaks. Let's be honest. It's true. We're control freaks. Loss of control means there are more changes than we can keep up with. And with loss, there's always grief. See how it just kind of perpetuates, goes around and around. And so there are hard times, of course. And Myrna says, most of us are great with change as long as change is our idea. Oh, then we can handle change just fine. But change imposed from the outside can send people into a tailspin. So keeping that in mind, change imposed from the outside, here we are in the middle of a pandemic, change imposed from the outside, extraordinary change bringing extraordinary loss. We have lost control of our lives, have we not? Everything that we've come to depend on for a lifetime has changed drastically. The people we see, the jobs we hold, the lifestyles that we have grown so accustomed to, these losses pile up. We are in grief. And damn, all those therapists are filled up with other people who are grieving about their losses. Can't get to see the therapist for help right now. It's pretty hard. Now, we have even lost that which we thought we can always count on, and that is predictability. When is this pandemic going to end? I don't know. Can't predict it. I've got no control over the matter. It's gone. And so we yearn for the time to go back to normal. Just go back to the way things were. Remember that time when we could control everything? But everything has now changed. So what happens is that we desperately want to believe that buried under all the rubble of loss is the normal. Let's dig out the normal as fast as we can and just return to it. I don't think so. After loss, there's no returning to the old normal. And we can understand this on the personal level when someone very dear to us dies. We can understand it on this grand scale of a global pandemic. After loss, there's no returning to the old normal. Too many changes. Can't go back. But change can also invite personal change deep within. Maybe we need to change ourselves during this grief process so that we can allow new meaning to enter our lives. Grief, which if you haven't noticed, is what we're all experiencing right now. But grief poses opportunities to examine life's deeper questions. By becoming aware of our grief, instead of denying it, we come into full contact with ourselves, our thoughts, our feelings, our identity. After suffering loss, become vehicles for our own evolution. In grief, we are prone to ask how we can live life better. Doesn't that stand to reason? We've probably, in losses that are really close to us, have asked that question. I don't hear us asking that question really on the big scale of loss. That is, how can I live my life better? This is not what happened in our reading today, when the author grieves over the death of his longtime friend, and he comes to realize how precious life is. Yes, an old cliche, but what it means is that time is the greatest treasure we possess. Every day, every hour, every minute, it's just invaluable as the years and decades go on and accumulate over time. And so it becomes ever so sweet when we give our time. Think about it. That's all that we really have. We give our time, this rare gift of time. We commit this time, of course, to those whom we love. And that's the message of love. We're giving our time to our spouse, our partner, our children, our friends, our profession, church community. We have no greater gift than the expenditure of our time. This is how we show our love. And when we absorb this reality, we begin to value not an accumulation of riches, but pathways to being more compassionate, living deeper spiritually, and in abiding by the ethics that will transform this world into a world of justice and fairness and love. And so once we become cognizant of this, then we understand this is who we hope to become. This is what we search for in our loss, in our grief. How can I evolve as a person? You know, the question might never even occur to me until I suffer loss. That change, the loss, the grief, really shakes up the molecules and helps me to look deeper within myself. The conclusion of our reading really resonated with me profoundly. Actually, it's a very simple lesson. Take pictures with your hearts of those whom you love and who love you. Keep them as a treasury to draw upon. Neither our vulnerability nor mortality itself is the enemy. They are but reminders of how precious each day, each kiss, each embrace. Peace be with you. Amen. We often refer to our church community as our church family, and rightfully so. We love the characters who comprise our church family, and we take great pleasure in their accomplishments, and we mourn their deaths as deeply painful. Today we want to hold up in our memories the precious lives lost to our church family this year. William Pete Peterson, Woody Renzetti, Diane Nielsen, Betsy Pollock, Lincoln Wilkes, Rollins Young, Eddie Ellison, Barbara Tanner. We hold these people lovingly in our hearts, and there may be others that you are holding in your hearts as well. Say their names out loud. Their loss has been shattering. Say the names. I'm just going to pause for a minute, allow you just to mention those who just, the names of those, they just form on your lips. Say their names. And we recall how shattering that loss was, and here we are trying to pick up the pieces and discover a more meaningful way to live our lives. We are, in fact, continuously learning the process of how we might walk through life a bit more nobly ourselves, a bit more mindful of life's true meaning. So let us bless those wonderful people who have been part of our church family. My sympathy extends to all of you who have had losses outside the church family. They are now at peace, and may we continue to lead a meaningful life. Amen.